Introduction to Science and Technology 9.
Good day everyone! I am Ma'am Irish Maniego and I'm going to be your science teacher for the whole school year. Welcome to our first day of online class. And to start with, our topic is all about the organs of the cardiovascular system, the blood and the blood clotting process, and lastly, the different blood groups. In Lesson 1, which is the organs of the cardiovascular system, you should be able to identify and describe the different organs of the cardiovascular system and the function of each organ. In Lesson 2, which is the blood and the blood clotting process, you should be able to identify the components of the blood, the function of each component, and the steps in blood clotting process. In Lesson 3, which is the different blood groups, you should be able to identify the different blood groups and describe the relationship of these groups. Now, let's proceed to the next slide.
Objectives of the lesson. Focus points. Identify and describe the structure of organs and tissues composing the cardiovascular system. Explain the function of each organ and describe the flow of the blood in the cardiovascular system.
Do you ever wonder why your heart's beating? It's an important organ, part of your internal cardiovascular system. Along with your blood and your vessels, you breathe in, oxygen goes into your lungs and your heart pumps blood in, absorbing oxygen carried throughout your whole body. Stay healthy, oxygen to muscles and absorb carbon dioxide waste and cycle back to the same place. It's the size of your fist, sitting just behind your ribs, weighing less than a pound, pumping blood through all out. 6 quarts of blood in your system, upper chamber, atrium, lower ventricles, blood's in it, 60 to 100 beats per minute, and it's pumping blood, circulating, vessels, veins, your arteries are big, thick blood carries nutrients and oxygen. Oh, you're pumping blood upper chambers, the atrium, receiving blood in bottom chambers are the ventricles. They pump blood out loud. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. The largest one is the aorta, and it receives blood from the left ventricle part. Continuing circulatory, blood cells stripped in liquid is known as the plasma, and your cell fragments called platelets help your blood form blood clots at 2 blood cell kinds, red and white. Red carries oxygen, hemoglobin, and white fights illness when you get open cuts and killing. Blood types you can be AB or AB, each distinctive antigens, antibodies are different. See, blood goes through this full cycle, every day keeps you alive, so to keep the system healthy, exercise plus eat your veggies, yo. Pumping blood, circulating, vessels, veins, your arteries are big, thick blood carries nutrients and oxygen. Oh, you're pumping blood upper chambers, the atrium, receiving blood in bottom chambers are the ventricles. They pump blood out loud. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Bum bum bum.
Lesson 1. The organs of the cardiovascular system.
Your heart, that throbbing, beating muscle, is probably the most iconic organ in your body. No other organ gets its own holiday or as much radio play, and you're unlikely to get a love note decorated with a kidney or a spleen, or even a brain, which is really what rules the emotions. Don't get me wrong, the heart does some great things. Namely, it powers the entire circulatory system, transporting nutrients, oxygen, waste, heat, hormones, and immune cells throughout the body over and over. But in the end, the heart does not make you love, it doesn't break apart if you get dumped by your boo, and it's not a lonely hunter. The truth is, the heart is really just a pump. A big, wet, muscly brute of a pump. And it doesn't care about poetry or chocolate or why you're crying. The heart has only one concern: maintaining pressure. If you've ever squeezed the trigger on a squirt gun or opened a can of shaken soda, you've seen how fluids flow from areas of high pressure, like inside the gun or the can, to areas of low pressure, like outside. The heart's entire purpose is to maintain that same kind of pressure gradient by generating high hydrostatic pressure to pump blood out of the heart while also creating low pressure to bring it back in. That gradient of force is what we mean when we talk about blood pressure. It's basically a measure of the amount of strain your arteries feel as your heart moves your blood around. More than 5 liters of it at about 60 beats per minute. That's about 100,000 beats a day, 35 million a year, 2 to 3 billion heartbeats in a lifetime. The basic physiology of which you can easily feel just by taking your own pulse. I don't have a watch. Now that might not inspire so much poetry, but it turns out it's still a pretty good story. Let us begin with a little anatomy. Unless you happen to be of the Grinch persuasion, the average adult human heart is about the size of 2 fists clasped together. One of the few bits of trivia you often hear about human anatomy that is actually true. The heart is hollow, vaguely cone-shaped, and weighs only about 250 to 350 grams, a pretty modest size for your body's greatest workhorse. And although Americans tend to put their right hand over their left breast while pledging allegiance, the heart is actually situated pretty much in the center of your chest, snuggled in the mediastinum cavity between your lungs. It sits at an angle though, with one end pointing inferiorly toward the left hip and the other toward the right shoulder, so most of its mass rests just a little bit left of the mid-sternal line. The heart is nestled in a double-walled sac called the pericardium. The tough outer layer, or fibrous pericardium, is made of dense connective tissue and helps protect the heart while anchoring it to some of the surrounding structures, so it doesn't bounce all over the place while it's beating. Meanwhile, the inner serous pericardium consists of an inner visceral layer, or epicardium, which is actually part of the heart wall, and an outer parietal layer. These two layers are separated by a thick film of fluid that acts like a natural lubricant, providing a slippery environment for the heart to move around in so it doesn't create friction as it beats. The wall of the heart itself is made of yet more layers, 3 of them. That epicardium on the outside, the myocardium in the middle, which is mainly composed of cardiac muscle tissue that does all the work of contracting, and the innermost endocardium, a thin white layer of squamous epithelial tissue. Deeper inside, the heart has a whole lot of moving pieces that I'm not going to pick apart here, because the really big thing to understand is how the general system of chambers and valves and veins and arteries all work together to circulate blood around your body. Of course, fluid likes to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and the heart creates those pressures. Form, once again, following function. Your heart is divided laterally into 2 sides by a thin inner partition called the septum. This division creates 4 chambers, 2 superior atria, which are the low pressure areas, and 2 inferior ventricles that produce the high pressures. Each chamber has a corresponding valve, which acts like a bouncer at a club at closing time, he'll let you out, but not back in. When a valve opens, blood flows in one direction into the next chamber, and when it closes, that's it. No blood can just flow back into the chamber it just left. So if you put your ear against someone's chest, and yeah, ask for permission first, you'll hear that lub-dub. Lub-dub. What you're really hearing are the person's heart valves opening and closing. It's a relatively simple but quite elegant setup, really. Functionally, those atria are the receiving chambers for the blood coming back to the heart after circulating through the body. The ventricles, meanwhile, are the discharging chambers that push the blood back out of the heart. As a result, the atria are pretty thin-walled because the blood flows back into the heart under low pressure, and all those atria have to do is push it down into the relaxed ventricles, which doesn't take a whole lot of effort. The ventricles are beastly by comparison. They're the true pumps of the heart, and they need big, strong walls to shoot blood back out of the heart with every contraction. And the whole thing is connected to the rest of your circulatory system by way of arteries and veins. We'll go into a whole lot more detail about these later, but the thing to remember first, if you don't already remember it, is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry it back toward the heart. To differentiate the two, anatomy diagrams typically depict arteries in red, while veins are drawn in blue, which incidentally is part of what has led to the common misconception misconception that your blood is actually blue at some point, but it isn't. It is always red. It's just a brighter red when there's oxygen in it. So let's look at how all this comes together, starting with a big burst of blood flowing out of your heart. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is just a big vessel that splits to form the left and right pulmonary arteries. From there, and this is the only time in your body where deoxygenated blood goes through an artery, the blood goes straight through the pulmonary artery into the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. It finds its way into very small, thin-walled capillaries, which allow materials to move in and out of the bloodstream. In the case of the lungs, oxygen moves in and carbon dioxide moves out. The blood then circles back to the heart by way of 4 pulmonary veins, where it keeps moving to the area of lowest pressure, because that is what fluids do, and in this case, that's the inside of the relaxed left atrium. Then the atrium contracts, which increases the pressure, so the blood passes down through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. So the thing that just happened here, where a wave of blood was pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs and then followed the lowest pressure back to the left atrium, there's a name for that. It is the pulmonary circulation loop. It's how your blood unloads its burden of carbon dioxide into the lungs and trades it in for a batch of fresh oxygen. It's short, it's simple, at least in the way I have time to describe it, and it's just delightfully effective. Of all the substances you need to continue existing, oxygen is the most urgent, the one without which you will die in minutes instead of hours or days or weeks. But it's pretty useless unless the oxygen can actually reach your cells, and that hasn't happened yet. For that, your newly oxygenated blood needs to travel through the rest of your organ systems and share the wealth. And that fantastic journey, known as the systemic loop, begins in the left ventricle when it flexes to increase pressure. Now, the blood would like to flow into the nice low-pressure left atrium where it just came from, but the mitral valve slams shut, forcing it through the aortic semilunar valve into your body's largest artery, nearly as big around as a garden hose, the aorta, which sends it to the rest of your body. And after all your various greedy muscles and neurons and organs and the heart itself have had their oxygen feast at the capillary bed buffet, that now oxygen-poor blood loops back to the heart, entering through the big superior and inferior vena cava veins straight into the right atrium. And when the right atrium contracts, the blood passes through the tricuspid valve into the relaxed right ventricle and right back to where we started. This whole double loop cycle plays out like a giant figure 8, heart to lung to heart to body to heart again, and runs off that constant high pressure, low pressure gradient exchange regulated by the heart valves. So the first lub that you hear in that lub-dub is made by the mitral and tricuspid valves closing. And they do that because your ventricles contract to build up pressure and pump blood out of the heart. This high pressure caused by ventricular contraction is called systole. Now, the dub sound. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about dubstep sounds. That's the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves closing at the start of diastole. That's when the ventricles relax to receive the next volume of blood from the atria. When those valves close, the high pressure blood that's leaving the heart tries to rush back in, but runs into the valves. So you know when you get your blood pressure measured and the nurse gives you 2 numbers, like 120/80. The first number is your systolic blood pressure, essentially the peak pressure produced by the contracting ventricles that push blood out to all your tissues. The second reading is your diastolic blood pressure, which is the pressure in your arteries when the ventricles are relaxed. These 2 numbers give your nurse a sense of how your arteries and ventricles are doing when they're experiencing both high pressure, the systolic, and low pressure, the diastolic. So if your systolic blood pressure is too low, that could mean that, say, the volume of your blood is too low, like maybe you've lost a lot of blood or you're dehydrated. And if your diastolic is too high, that could mean that your blood pressure is high even when it's supposed to be lower. Considering how much we've talked about the importance of homeostasis, it should come as no surprise that blood pressure that's too high or too low, or anything that affects your blood's ability to move oxygen around, can be dangerous. Prolonged high blood pressure can damage arterial walls, mess with your circulation, and ultimately endanger your heart, your lungs, brain, kidneys, and nearly every part of you. So I guess you could say that the best way to break a heart is to mess with its pressure. But good luck trying to write a song about that. Today you learned how the heart's ventricles, atria, and valves create a pump that maintains both high and low pressure to circulate blood from the heart to the body through your arteries and bring it back to the heart through your veins. We also talked about what systolic and diastolic blood pressure are and how they're measured. Thanks to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for free through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making these videos and also maybe want to get some cool stuff, you can check out patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
First, what is circulatory system? Circulatory system, it is responsible in transporting materials throughout the entire body. It transports nutrients, water, and oxygen to the billions of body cells composing the multicellular body, heals and fights infections, and at the same time removes waste from them. The circulatory system functions as an intricate highway that reveals throughout the entire body, supplying the body cells with the materials they need to survive. The circulatory system has two divisions, the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. Cardiovascular system is the organ system that transports nutrients, gases, hormones, and other materials to and from the cells of the body. It also functions in fighting diseases and helps stabilize body temperature and pH to maintain homeostasis. The cardiovascular system is composed of three: the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. The heart. It is the muscular organ that pumps the blood to the different parts of the body. It is located at the middle of the chest cavity with its tip or apex slightly tilted towards the left. The heart is just as big as one's own clenched fist. The heart is enclosed by the pericardium. There are three layers tissue of the heart: epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Epicardium. It is the inner part of the pericardium that is closely adhered to the heart. Myocardium. It is the middle muscular part of the pericardium that is composed of cardiac muscle tissue. Endocardium. It is the thin layer of the tissue that lines the muscle of the heart. The chambers of the heart. The human heart is a four-chambered heart. The interior of the heart is divided into four chambers, namely right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. What is the difference between atrium and ventricles? Atrium are the receiving chambers of the heart. These chambers are the thin-walled, while ventricles are the pumping chambers of the heart. These chambers are the thick-walled. Right atrium. The function of right atrium receives oxygen for blood from the vena cava, which is the large vein. Left atrium. The function of left atrium, it receives blood from the pulmonary veins. Left ventricle. The function of left ventricle, it pumps oxygen-rich blood to all parts of the body. Right ventricle. The function of right ventricle, it pumps blood to the lungs for oxygenation. Valves are flaps of muscles that prevents blood from back flowing. The two sets of valves are the atrioventricular valves and the pulmonary valves that work together to ensure that blood will move only in one direction. The two sets of valves are the atrioventricular valves and pulmonary valves. Atrioventricular valves is also known as the cuspid valves that are located between the atria and ventricles. Pulmonary valves. are located at the base of the large vessels leaving the ventricles. The right atrioventricular valves is the tricuspid valves, while the left atrioventricular valves is the bicuspid valve. The valve between right ventricle and pulmonary artery is the pulmonary semilunar valve, while the valve between the atria and ventricle and the aorta is the aortic semilunar valve.
No doubt about it, your heart is a champion. It electrifies itself, it maintains your blood pressure, it keeps your blood moving, and it's got like a nice shape you can put some chocolates inside of and give to people you like. But the circulatory system is much, much more than just that pump, because the heart also needs a network to actually send all that blood through, right? Cue the blood vessels. Although it's easy to think of them as a glorified plumbing system for your body, that's not a very good analogy. These aren't just passive tubes made merely to carry liquid around like the pipes behind your walls at your home. Blood vessels are actually active, dynamic organs capable of contracting and expanding as they deliver oxygen and nutrients to cells throughout the body, carry away waste products, and do their part in maintaining that all-important blood pressure. You already know about the three major types of blood vessels: the arteries that carry blood away from the heart, the veins that bring it back, and the little capillaries that act as the transfer station between the two. But you've also got arterioles, which are like mini arteries that branch out into those capillaries, and venules, the smallest vein components that suck blood back out of the capillaries and merge into the larger veins that head home to the heart. And it's quite an incredible journey, really. If all your blood vessels could be strung together in a single line, they'd stretch out for 100,000 kilometers. That's like, if you, and then carry the two. It's like 2.5 times around the Earth. And together, this extensive network forms a closed system that begins and ends at the heart. That means that all 5 or so liters of blood in your body are contained within it at all times, unless you're bleeding, which I hope you're not. If you prick a finger and watch a drop of blood pop up, you know that you've nicked a blood vessel, and that blood is leaking out of its closed system. Likewise, if you slam your shin against the corner of a coffee table on your way to the bathroom, and an hour later you see a big nasty bruise forming, then you know you've damaged your blood vessels again, because bruising is internal bleeding, usually into loose connective tissue. And if you're embarrassed about that shriek that you let out when you bumped your leg and you start to blush, well, that's your blood vessels too, expanding, just to say hello. Blood vessels are another great example of how anatomy and physiology go together like peanut butter and jelly. How they look and what they do go hand in hand. Most of your blood vessels share a similar structure consisting of 3 layers of tissue surrounding the open space or lumen that actually holds the blood. Anatomists call these layers tunics, and the innermost section is called the tunica intima, which should be pretty easy to remember because, you know, it's like has intimate contact with the lumen. It's like your circulatory underpants. The cool thing about this layer is that it contains the endothelium, which you may remember is made up of simple squamous epithelium tissue and is continuous with the lining of the heart. These cells form a slick surface that helps the blood move without friction. Surrounding the tunica intima is the middle layer, the tunica media, which is made of smooth muscle cells and sheets of the protein elastin. That smooth muscle tissue is regulated in part by the nerve fibers of the autonomic nervous system, which can decrease the diameter of the lumen by contracting this middle layer during vasoconstriction or expand it by relaxing during vasodilation. That right there should tell you that the tunica media plays a key role in blood flow and blood pressure, because the smaller the diameter of the blood vessel, the harder it is for blood to move through it. Kind of like trying to drink milk through a cocktail straw versus a soda straw. And finally, the outermost layer of your blood vessels is the tunica externa. It's like an overcoat if that coat were made mostly of loosely woven collagen fiber. Actually, if your coat happens to be made of leather, it is made of collagen, and like a coat, this outer layer is what protects and reinforces the whole blood vessel. Now, the ratio of the thicknesses of these 3 layers varies between blood vessels of different types, because guess what? Yes, form follows function. Let's take a look. Say you're gearing up for a big tournament of thumb wrestling, or what has been called the miniature golf of martial arts. How does blood move through your systemic circulatory loop to get from your heart to your champion right thumb flexing muscle, the flexor pollicis brevis, and back again? Well, you will remember from our lessons on the heart that blood leaves the left ventricle through the aorta, the biggest and toughest artery in your body, roughly the diameter of a garden hose, flows. The aorta and its major branches are elastic arteries. They contain more elastin than any other blood vessel type, so they can absorb the large pressure fluctuations as blood leaves the heart. What's more, that elasticity actually dampens that pressure so that big surges don't reach the smaller vessels where they could cause damage. This is really where that whole pipe analogy falls apart. These arteries are really more like balloons. Their pressure reservoir is able to expand and recoil with every heartbeat. If they were rigid like pipes, they'd eventually leak or burst after being battered by so many waves of pressure. So that blood leaves your aorta, and since it's heading to your thumb, it travels along the elastic subclavian artery, which gives way to a series of muscular arteries, in this case the brachial artery in your upper arm and the radial artery in the lower arm. Muscular arteries distribute blood to specific body parts and account for most of your named arteries. They're less elastic and more muscular. These arteries invest in additional smooth muscle tissue and proportionally have the thickest tunica media of any blood vessel. This allows them to contract or relax through vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which we've talked about a lot in terms of the nervous system's stress response. These arteries keep tapering down until they turn into the nearly microscopic arterioles that feed into the smallest of your blood vessels, your tiny, extremely thin-walled capillaries, which serve as a sort of exchange or bridge between your arterial and venous systems. They may be little, but your capillaries are where the big important exchange of materials actually happens. Capillary walls are made of just a single layer of epithelial tissue, which form only the tunica intima, so they're able to deliver oxygen and other nutrients in your blood to their cellular destinations through diffusion. The capillaries are also where those cells can dump their carbon dioxide and other waste back into the blood and send it away, through the veins to the lungs and kidneys, but we'll come back to that in a second. Unlike arteries and veins, capillaries don't operate on their own, but rather form interweaving groups called capillary beds. Besides exchanging nutrients and gases, your capillary beds also help regulate blood pressure and play a role in thermoregulation. Say you're in the room where you're practicing your thumb calisthenics, which probably isn't the thing, but the room is a little chilly, so the blood feeding your dermis loses a lot of heat to that cold air. Well, smooth muscle forms tiny sphincters, yeah, you got sphincters everywhere, around the vessels that lead to each of your capillary beds. When they tighten up, they force blood to bypass some of those capillaries, which means less blood is exposed to the cold, and you lose less heat. If it's really cold, the smooth muscles around your larger arterioles and muscular arteries, like that radial artery in your lower arm, will also squeeze, slowing blood flow to your whole hand, which is no way to win at thumb wrestling. But it's one reason why your fingers get all stiff and numb in the cold. They're not getting as much warm blood because your blood vessels are trying to conserve heat. Conversely, if your thumb is working really hard and producing heat from all that exertion, those capillary sphincters relax and open wide, flooding the capillary bed with blood to help disperse heat, which is part of the reason that you might get red-faced when you're hot or exercising hard. So anyway, now your thumb muscles have just feasted on a batch of oxygen and glucose served up on a fresh bed of capillary, and they're ready to take out the trash. The cells send their CO2 and other junk out to the venal end of the capillary exchange, where the capillaries unite into venules and then merge into veins that head back to the heart. Remember that the pressure in these vessels has to be dropping, since fluids always flow from higher to lower pressure. But since the pressure is so low in your veins, it's like 1/12 of the pressure in your arteries, there isn't much pressure gradient left to push the blood back to your heart. So veins require some extra adaptations to keep the blood moving in the right direction. That's why some of them, especially veins in the arms and legs that have to work against gravity, have venous valves that help keep the blood from flowing backward. If those valves leak or a vein experiences too much pressure, the backflow of blood can stretch and twist the vein, leaving you with varicose veins, or if this happens in another part of the body, hemorrhoids. But anyway, we've gotten pretty far from your thumb at this point. We got a loop to finish here. From the capillaries and venules in your thumb, that low-pressure blood flows from the radial vein to the brachial vein to the subclavian vein, where it dumps into the superior vena cava and settles for a second in the right atria before dropping into the right ventricle. From there, it's sent to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated and then comes back into the left atria before sliding down into the left ventricle, where it builds up pressure again and spurts back out into your aorta. It takes about a minute for all the blood in your body to complete that circuit, which means even if you're mostly at rest, your hard-working circulatory system moves about 7,500 liters of blood through your heart every day. Just in the time that you've been sitting there listening to me, probably about 52 liters has coursed through. So yes, much like the internet, your blood vessels are more than just a series of tubes. During the time that you've been circulating all that blood, you learned about the basic three-layer structure of your blood vessels, how those structures differ slightly in different types of vessels, and you followed the flow of blood from your heart to capillaries in your right thumb and all the way back to your heart again. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this, you can go to patreon.com/Crash Course. Also, a big thank you to Matthew Pierce for co-sponsoring this episode of Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course Studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake D. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The editor and script supervisor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
The blood vessels in the heart. What is blood vessels? Blood vessels are the network of channels that convey blood to all parts of the body. As the blood travels throughout the body, it remains confined within these blood vessels. Blood vessels are classified into three: the arteries, veins, and the capillaries. Arteries. It conveys oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. The largest artery is the aorta, and the smallest arteries are the arterioles.
Wave Beats Music.
The arterial walls consist of three layers of tissues: tunica externa, tunica media, and tunica intima. Tunica externa, it is the outermost layer part of the tissue. It is composed of connective tissue containing varying amounts of elastic and collagenous fibers. Tunica media, it is the middle layer, the thickest layer, which is composed primarily of layers of smooth muscles. And lastly, tunica intima, it is the innermost layer. Veins. It conveys blood coming from all parts of the body towards the heart. The largest vein in the human heart is the vena cava, and the smallest vein is what we call venules. The vein is also composed of three layers of tissue: tunica adventitia, tunica media, and tunica intima. Capillaries are the smallest and the numerous blood vessels. They form the connection between the arterioles and the venules. Their main function is the exchange of materials, gases, nutrients, and waste products of metabolism between the blood and the tissue cells. There are two pathways of blood circulation: the pulmonary pathway and systematic pathway. Pulmonary circulation. In this circuit, blood coming from all parts of the body is oxygenated. Oxygen-poor blood returns to the right atrium of the heart by way of the superior and inferior vena cava. And for the summary, cardiovascular system is the organ system that transport nutrients, gases, hormones, and other materials to and from the cells of the body. The heart is the pumping organ of the cardiovascular system. The heart has four chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. The blood vessels convey blood to the different parts of the body. There are three types of blood vessels: the artery, veins, and capillaries.
Wave Beats Music.